Okay, welcome everybody to the first of our Poetics and Translation seminars. It's a great pleasure to introduce our first speaker on a topic I'm excited to hear about, and a philosopher I'm excited to hear about, Bachelard. Professor Adam Geary from the Law Department here at Birkbeck. I've just picked out highlights from his impressive profile. He's been visiting professor and scholar all over the world, including universities of Makerere in Uganda, Pretoria, Berkeley, California. He also is active in teaching on the external law degree offered by the University of London's international programme. Now, with regard to his research, amongst his many publications have been two completed British Academy funded projects, the first of which is a collection of essays collected under the title Islam, Law and Identity, which he co-published with Marinos Diamantidis in 2010. And the second is an engagement with critical legal studies and forms of radical legal thought in the United States. Published in 2020. His most recent book is Poverty, Law and Legal Activism, published at Routledge 2018. And I'm told, hot off the press this morning, that Adam's paper on Bachelard today is part of a work in progress tentatively entitled Psychic Jurisprudence. So I'm fascinated to hear about that. And he's also trying to write a book on haunted property, or loca infecta, I assume is the Latin term. So over to you, Adam.
Thank you very much indeed. It's a real honour and a privilege to be here. And if you forgive me, I would like to just do a very brief introduction in French, but rest assured that the torment will soon be over and I will switch back to English. And for the most part it will be in English, but I've tried to use sections from Bachelard that are important in the French and to offer a translation as well. And I will start with an accurate translation, but let me just get this out of the way whilst I'm in the mood. J'aimerais commencer par une brève introduction en français. Je crois que mon accent anglais soit si fort que même si vous ne pourriez pas suivre le français, vous comprenez ce que j'essaie de dire. Je serai donc très bref pour éviter des souffrances inutiles. Je voudrais remercier Nathalie, Damien et Akane pour l'invitation à faire cette présentation et à vous d'être venus entendre cette expérience de mon rêve. L'idée clé de cette étude, s'il en est une, est que nous devons rêver d'une manière de penser la loi. Je voudrais également me excuser par avance pour toutes les erreurs de prononciation, de grammaire et de traduction. J'espère qu'au moins certaines d'entre elles sont des erreurs créatives. Back to English. I'd particularly like to thank Professor Tony Lester, who's a scholar and the artist in residence at the Institute of Advanced Legal Studies, who've been kind enough to come over for this paper. So the title is Don't Fade Away, and the opening point, I think, is about Bachelard as a guide to a method, a possible method, a way of researching a very strange form of normativity. Now, this is a kind of technical word that lawyers and jurisprudents use. Normativity, and I want to get the jurisprudence out of the way relatively quickly. What you ought or ought not do. So normativity is about rules, legal rules, but rules in general, and being bound. So what I'm kind of concerned with is this phenomena of being bound, which if you read your way into jurisprudence, it's kind of the bread and butter of jurisprudence. What is the phenomena of being bound? And I want to take from Bachelard, both as an idea and as a method, I suppose, a mode of what in English I'm going to call fascination or attachment, that is a way of being bound, okay, not in the conventional way that jurisprudence or lawyers think of the term being bound, but in the terms that Bachelard elaborates, a form of fascination with text or with the world, which is likewise a kind of a participation or a fascination. And I think that this experience, or at least on my reading of Bachelard, is found particularly in Reverie. And in a moment I'll have to distinguish Reverie from dreaming, because Bachelard is very careful to do that. Translation, and in some senses this paper begins with translation, and in poetry. And the poem that I really want to talk about is one by H.D., which is not about Narcissus, but it's about Psyche, and I will explain why this poem appears when we get closer to it or deeper in the descent. If there was a single thing that I think I would like to leave you with, it's actually an image, and that's the image of sunlight on water, which is incredibly important for Bachelard and for the psychic, what he calls the psychic détente, the relaxed fascination that takes you into reverie. This then is an attempt to think with poetry and with images. And this image, paradoxically, because I think Bachelard is an interesting and paradoxical thinker, this idea of surface will also become an idea of depth. And I think that is explained in turn by the play of light on water. And I suppose the other thing to give, but this might be giving away my best line, but let me do it at the beginning, it would be giving away the punchline. I think one of Bachelard's absolutely blinding, if you'll forgive the pun, insights is that Narcissus stares into a pool. He sees this image in a pool, in water. It's not a mirror. It's not a mirror. And I want to use that to try and forgive me, I'm kind of got my own problems with Jacques Lacan at the moment. I'm not going to go on endlessly about the mirror stage. To the extent that it's important, I will, but the fundamental point here is one of an image. In place of the mirror, and in place of a kind of psychoanalytic appropriation of Narcissus as somebody who, suffers a particular fate in relation to a reflection seen in the mirror, Bachelard's Narcissus, and it may have also, I mean, it's not unique to Bachelard, but it's, I think he's cathecting, if you like, he's picking up on this thinking, is an image seen not in a swimming pool. That's simply a place where I read a lot of Bachelard in the summer. And so this is what I like about Bachelard. The beginning of La Reverie book is basically a story of him as a youth following rivers in the countryside in Champagne. And so what I found completely compelling in reading Bachelard is the way in which there is the voice of the philosopher, the voice of the linear argument, the voice of the typology of dreams and reveries, but also these endless kind of digressions that sometimes come back to the starting point and sometimes don't. And so I thought, well, if Gaston Bachelard can talk about the rivers of his childhood, and childhood, if I get round to it, I'll try and say something about childhood, but perhaps within the context of psychoanalysis, that it seems important to have your own reflections on water. And given a perfect world, I think this would have been a paper given in summer on a riverbank, and it would have hopefully been the chance to fall into reverie, into this kind of focused but detached fascination, which is, I think, what I wanted to evoke here. And unfortunately, there is too much linearity in this paper, but nevertheless, if I could evoke anything, it's sitting by water in the sunlight. The starting point, as I said, was really with translation and with trying to write this book that's tentatively called Psychic Jurisprudence. And I am going to come back to Bachelard in a minute, allow me this slight jurisprudential digression. This is Sarah Austin, who was the wife of John Austin, who was the author of one of the most important and turgid legal jurisprudential textbooks, which more or less, other than Hobbes's Leviathan, really founds conventional, what we would call analytic jurisprudence. And the experience of writing and giving lectures drove John Austin into a profound depression. And really the book only exists because Sarah Austin recomposed it from his notes. Sarah Austin was, in the period, actually better known, way better known than her husband, whose star set and then rose again. Sarah Austin was very well known as a translator, primarily from the German, but from the French as well. And so as part of psychic jurisprudence, it was an attempting to find other voices, if you like, other ways of reading, and other writers, and other modes in which the extremely daylight world of, and in certain senses, untranslatable. You know, it's what Austin was about was single fixed terms that would give him this science of jurisprudence. And I think it must have been a torment for Sarah Austin to try and edit this stuff because she worked in a different way. She was a translator. She had a completely different feel and understanding of language, and she's largely forgotten, in fact completely erased within jurisprudence. So the first, if there's anything going on in the book, it's an attempt to say, look, this translator, okay, well known in her day, less well known now, but I think within translation studies, relatively well known, is really responsible for modern analytical jurisprudence. Without Sarah Austin, it would have completely disappeared. But the paradox and the irony of that is a particular voice gets written out of jurisprudence, the voice of the dreamer, the voice of the poet, the voice of the translator. And what I think is so interesting about Sarah Austin, and I wanted to compare that to what to me is almost the opening statement of Anglophone jurisprudence, which is from Hobbes's Leviathan, which is the great book of the sovereign, the great book of the lawgiver. And the great command of the lawgiver is, read thyself, nosce typesum. Typesum is that reading from the side, which is an interesting way of going into a text. Obviously what the sovereign wants is a single translation of ourselves. The sovereign wants us to obey the law the sovereign makes. I'm being incredibly compressed here, there's more to it than that, but for this major statement, Hobbes is obviously writing at a time, a couple of hundred years before Austin, but Austin really takes the weird book that's Leviathan, this kind of mythopoetic text of sovereignty, and turns it into a kind of scientific analytical jurisprudence. And I think that around the edges of Leviathan, and this command for a single translation, if we're trying to read back in a different voice, a different feeling, then I wanted Sarah Austin to, as it were, apply obliquely to this command, read thyself. And what Sarah Austin does is, in her translations, she effaces herself completely. Sometimes in the prefaces she appears, but otherwise she's almost like Echo, who's faded away from the text with which she's fascinated. Although at one point in a translation, I think it's of Guizot, it's something from the French. No, sorry, it's from fragments of German prose writers. She uses a French expression to explain to English readers what she's done and how she's done it. So, index raisonné, which is the simultaneous effacement of Sarah Austin, but her presence as this kind of compiler, the translator, who has to resort to a French term to explain to an English reader that these German fragments that she's brought together, a weird set of kind of bits of Kant and Goethe and what have you, have been put together in a certain spirit. Psyche is behind them, speaking through Sarah Austin. And she refers to a measure, in rather oblique and interesting way. My readers must therefore apply measures as different of those which I have used, which to me is now a different kind. Measure is a normative word. Rules are how we measure ourselves. Law is about the correct measure. And what we've got here, I think, is an oblique measure. A measure which is about the difficulty of translation, of how one chooses possible paths through different words, or indeed wants to wander all those paths at the same time, employ those different voices, and to just kind of refer to another important source that's been a very important source for me, and again out of pure coincidence it turned out that me and Tony and I were reading this American poet, Lucille Clifton, and I just really want to... Lucille Clifton is not a translator, she's a major American poet, but at some level she communicates with, I think, the argument here, particularly this line, which is, I think, a significant line for psychic jurisprudence, because she's transcribing messages from spirits on a kitchen table. She calls them the wands. And they tell her, we are here between the lines. And that seemed to me, again, to evoke a kind of translation, a kind of errancy of meaning, a kind of wandering path. So Lucille Clifton is certainly kind of one of the presences in the book. She's less of a presence here, but perhaps in so being, she's the spirit of Psyche. And Psyche is an image, an imago, a summoning, something fleeting, but nevertheless material, an immaterial something with material effects. I'll come back to Psyche because I want to go straight to Bachelard. And there he is at his desk in Paris. And Bachelard is our guide here. Not, so I'm leaving Sarah Austin behind here, but I think she'll always be with us on our journey here, as will Persephone. We'll meet Persephone later on. Narcissus, of course, Echo, and Psyche as well. Psyche is evoked by Narcissus, and he evokes Psyche and Narcissus, less so Persephone, I think, in talking about la loi. Now, I know, and I don't really want to do and go into, if anybody wants to pick up le droit and la loi, you can do that in French, you can do it, I think, in German, direct and rect, less so in English. But I want to talk of, Bachelard uses the word la loi, so I'm going to follow that, and I think it's useful, again, because I think if something... Well, he expresses it in different ways here, but I'm going to try and gloss these ideas with the idea that there is a law of reverie. A law of reverie. And the opening quotation, interception, I'm not sure how to pronounce that. The interception, or the bringing together, folding within something from, I think, the Latin, intus, within, suscipere, to receive within. So whatever this mode of fascination or attachment to a text or to a world is, it's something that we receive within. In psychoanalytic terms, we could perhaps relate it to the imago, to the internalisation of those images that ultimately we become. And again, if you want the kind of the psychoanalytic references, well, Narcissus becomes incredibly important for thinking about those images and the sustenance that our psychic mechanism, in, I guess, paradoxical ways, draws on various imagos that we've introjected or incorporated, would be the kind of technical terms. I'm going to leave those to one side, but I can't help thinking they're analogous. That whatever this fascination or attachment, whatever the loi is that Bachelard evokes in terms of what comes to us in reverie, comes to us in this, and he uses the word, he uses a great jurisprudential word, to be bound, to be bound. We are bound in fascination. These are very approximate translations. I think another slide has some more some textual references, but I'm trying to kind of summarise to get to the key idea, I guess. We are bound in fascination. We are attached. We participate. That great kind of Aquinian, Aristotelian word that's there in modern natural law thinking. This is a long way from natural law. I don't want, and again, I'm hoping nobody here is. Again, it depends on your audience. I guess if this was law, and a lot of people go, oh, well, this is a natural law argument. It's not a natural law argument at all. Because natural law is discoverable, at least in terms of... This isn't. You never know what it is. All you are is bound or fascinated. What it is you're bound or fascinated by, well, that leaves it. That's the issue, I think, here. You're bound to what you don't know, but you are bound. All the same, you're fascinated, you are attached, you are seized by something, this law. So it is a binding, not in a jurisprudential sense, but in this poetic sense. This coming within, something from the outside enters within, which again is a really useful, I think this is pure errancy of meaning. I'm not sure this is directly in Bachelard, but it's there's an idea in canon law of the forum internum, which becomes in modern ideas the idea of conscience, where something outside enters within, the voice of conscience, okay, moral term, legal term. In canon law, the forum internum, fora, there's plural, the forum internum and the forum externum are fundamental to what we are, to our internality. And there's a lot of kind of the law of confession and various things within ecclesiastical law, if you like, are very much concerned with this idea. I'm going to call it interiority, but it's an interiority where one is bound, where one should internalise the imago Dei, if you like, or the correct path. Yes, that's the notion of what is internalised, of a normativity that's internalised. Not law, well, church law or divine law, sacred law. So it's a congruent idea to jurisprudence, but for Bachelard and for psychoanalysis, there are parallel tracks, I think, about what is a binding that is internalised. But this is an imaginative binding. Indeed, that last quotation there is the beginning of a very brief reading of a poem by Malame Ariodade. It's the John the Baptist story. We could come back to it. I've got it. I thought I wouldn't have time to do it properly, so I kind of left it in the margins. So suffice to say that Bachelard is talking about this idea of law, imaginative attachment, imaginative fascination. That really brings us, I think, to something I'm going to have to do relatively quickly because I'm not so sure that Pierre Legendre is well known, but he is in a certain school of psychoanalytic jurisprudence. He is this major figure. He's fundamentally a Lacanian analyst and a legal historian. And one of his, I mean, there's a lot of Legendre, but what his fundamental move is, or one of his fundamental moves, is to take the idea of the mirror stage in Lacan and the notion that the unconscious is structured like a language and say, well, no, the unconscious is structured like a jurist. So what Legendre is doing is taking the Narcissus myth, and in particular, the idea that law operates through unconscious attachment. So the link with Narcissus would be that what law at a social level provides us with is substantial being. It prevents us fading away. It prevents us suffering the fate of Narcissus. Very crudely, we fall in love with an institution. That institution is the institution of the law. Strictly, really, Legendre is talking about the reception of Roman law. And he makes great reference to Gratian, who has a doctrine of dreams. So if Legendre was here, that we were talking about reverie and dreams, it would not be at all surprising to Legendre. Indeed, if you were a canon lawyer, this was the medieval period, you would perhaps not be that surprised that somebody talking about the law wanted to talk about dreaming, wanted to talk about reveries, and indeed was using the myth of Narcissus to try and access these ideas. Heretical, certainly in the terms of conventional jurisprudence, but within a kind of a way of thinking about the law, the myth of Narcissus becomes incredibly important. The fundamental idea would be that law, rules, legal institutions provide us with substantial being, but we have to fall in love with it. It's an affective bond then. We are bound or fascinated to the law. Before reason kicks in, then this is an unconscious bond. This would be the fundamental idea, that reason can take us so far, the analytical science of jurisprudence can take us so far, but unless we have recourse to the unconscious, we're never going to truly understand how normativity operates. And I think this is, again, I'm not sure to what extent. I felt I should try and do some translations, given that this is about poetics and translation. And I'm not sure if it's from the book there, the French paragraph, and then my attempts to translate it into English. But the fundamental idea is, I think, the one that I've explained. So I don't really want to go through it in detail. But I want to really use Legendre and Bachelard as foils. Do we have to read Narcissus in this way? Does the myth of Narcissus lead to the notion that the unconscious bond with the law requires us to fall in love with the law, because otherwise there is no substantial social being? So if you're familiar, there's kind of, I guess, it's a kind of cachet in general terms. Hobbes's, state of war, state of nature, where life is nasty, brutish and short. Well, in Legendrian terms, that's exactly what happens if we don't fall in love with the law. If we don't accept the legal prosthesis that gives us organised social being, we destroy each other. We destroy ourselves, we destroy each other. So it's really a kind of a nuance of a way of thinking about law that, again, if you've even kind of dabbled in these ideas, it kind of has a currency. So it's not that unusual. It's perhaps a little bit unusual if you don't associate dreaming, the unconscious, and poetics with law. But fundamentally, I'm not sure I want to agree with Legendre. I'm not sure in the end that this way of thinking, that Bachelard's dreaming, word dreaming, does lead us to falling in love with the law. I think we can fall in love with other things. And it's what those other things are that I think I want to try and pursue. These are just some other kind of textual references from two books of Bachelard, La Poétique and Water and Dreams, which are really evoking these notions of being and the soul. So what is it that we fall in, what is it that we are, in Bowie's terms, what is it that takes a part of me? Right? The law of interceptions is there in Bowie's fascination from young Americans. So once, as ever, Bowie is well ahead of the pack. So the idea of being, the astonishment of being. So this idea of astonishment for Bachelard is the falling in love with being. And very, very crudely, I mean, again, it's probably Thursday at whatever time, 2:30, to start talking about ontology is probably not a good idea. But the fundamental idea is, I think it works for me. It works for me. You find stuff fascinating. You fall in love with the world, with what's going on, with its provocations. Doesn't always have to be the case, but to the extent that you enter into reverie, then what is going on in that reverie is a kind of detached fascination with the world. It's not dreaming, and if there's time I'll come back to, I think Bachelard has I'm not quite sure he gets, certainly in the Poetics of Reverie, Freudian idea of dreaming is a bit of a straw person argument that he can use to erect this kind of theory of reverie. I think he's actually much closer to certain heterodox traditions in psychoanalysis, not Lacanian ones. Andre Green, I thought he was quite close to. Green making a distinction between kind of a deathly Narcissus and a Narcissus of life. And I think if there was a way of equating, at least in psychoanalytic terms, Bachelard's argument with a tradition within psych, kind of Lacanian but not Lacanian, it would be Andre Green and the Narcissism of life, which I think is another gloss for this idea that I think probably would give us a way of moving towards it, which is the falling in love with the world, the fascination, the attachment, the participation with the world, with texts, and with people. It's a social ontology as well as an understanding of our embeddedness in the world, and it's about the soul. I think that Bachelard is talking about the soul in a very, very interesting way as the thing that is bound, the thing that is fascinated. This language of the soul becomes quite an interesting one. It's one I want to try and follow, because the soul is linked to the journey into the self for Bachelard, which is a descent, which seems to me to evoke all kinds of other figures, Orpheus, Theseus, all these people who descend into Hades, descend into hell. Dante would be a Christianized version, obviously, and return with something, often not with something good or with something that's both good and bad, a Narcissus of life, a Narcissus of death. It's an ambiguous return. And I think fascination is ambiguous. To go back to Sarah Austin's voice, the translator's quest for meanings, we all know there's a play of infinite meanings, like sunlight on water. There's meanings coming into focus, going out of focus. It's how you work with ambiguity, how you work with the murmuring, the shading, the non-linear, or the kind of, I was going to say dialectic, but let me say it, because if anybody wants, I can clarify what I mean. But this dialect, I think there are dialectics going on in Bachelard, not Hegelian ones. I don't think he's a great reader of Hegel. Let's leave that there. Let's not talk about dialectics. The point really here, I think these are just other. But I might come back to the Valerie thing, because I think that's part of the distinction between dreaming and reverie, which I'll come back to. He talks about a phenomenology of dreaming, of reverie, a phenomenology of reverie, which I take to be, again, this way of just grouping together these terms to kind of talk about an ontology of the world. And I included the world there, I mean, in the most cosmic, most general of terms, a social world and a natural world. And of course, this is to do with imagination and with the soul. The soul is both inside us and outside us. The soul is the world folded into us, and the world is our soul folded out. I mean, you could get pantheistic, I don't want to. I think that becomes a little bit too blurred, but I think there is an interesting dialectic at work in this thinking of the soul. So what is the soul? I mean, do we really want to start this, language of the soul? I think we do. But what is it that the soul comes across? The soul is the thing fascinated in the end. The soul is a kind of interiority, but it's an interiority that's always connected with exteriority. And it's double, it's plural, irretrievably so. And it's a graft. Now, whether or not, in psychoanalytic terms, it's the way in which a selfie psyche processes its imagos, which it might be. The psychic mechanism cycles through imagos, the internalisation of those others that are important to us, who might be dead, who might be alive, who we might not have met yet. Those with whom we are fascinated, with whom we have introjected and incorporated into our own imago of ourselves. And the imago is ambiguous. The imago itself is always changing. And the link between translation, and this is a kind of I guess this is a rather obvious point in some ways. The idea of translation and transference in psychoanalysis is, I can't help thinking, a really useful idea to talk about these ways in which ambiguous words, in which phenomena that are inherently ambiguous, that could be life-giving or deathly, are worked out, and in which involve a revisiting, which involve a descent and a return to surface with some kind of ambiguous gift. So these figures of descent and ascent, which are so important, less so in the Reverie book, more in the Water and Dreams book and the other books on the imagination, of figures of rising and falling, seem to me the way in which Bachelard himself is working with these images and working through this notion of the soul and the way that the soul is bound. This is then the descent into the self, the caverns of our being. And what we find that when we descend into ourselves is doubleness, is, I think, a kind of androgyny. We descend into the otherness. The farther one descends into the depths of the speaking being, we are speaking beings, the more simply the essential otherness of any speaking being designates itself as the otherness of the masculine and the feminine. That's Bowie arriving in the States in his dress. So perhaps the unconscious is Bowie. I think there's a strong argument to say that when you do descend into yourself, when you start thinking with images, you access the soul of Bowie. And that the soul is Bowie. The soul is entirely double, androgynous, a endless cycling of images in the depths of the self, if you like. But you can only, I think, descend if you descend keeping in mind the ascent, keeping in mind the image of water on sunlight, keeping in mind the return from night to the day. And really the simultaneous play between these surfaces. What about Narcissus turned into a flower then? It's actually a Norman Wisdom sang a song about Narcissus. In distinction to Legendre's myth of Narcissus and the way in which law captures our soul, essentially. And the salutary lesson from the Narcissus myth is just this: unless the law captures your imago or gives you the imago that sustains your being, unless the sovereign imago becomes imaginable, becomes you will simply fade away, you'll disappear. Or we will disappear from ourselves. You will disappear from yourself, you will lack civic being or substantial being, and society itself will disappear from itself. I think that ignores this entire reading of Bachelard's of a more primordial fascination. And so I'm not sure if I can do this, but the idea of la loi seemed to me at least to resonate with the idea of what we're talking about here is something way more primordial. And by that I simply mean prior to the jurisprudence obsession with analytical jurisprudence and the legal system. So this is, we're going deeper in, if you like, to rise to the surface later on with a different idea of law, with a different idea of thinking about law. And therefore with a different idea of the Narcissus myth, of what happens to Narcissus, of what Narcissus's fate is. And I think that this is just truly, it really excited me to read this bit of the Reverie book. I'm just keeping an eye on the clock. And so perhaps I could just read this little bit out, because I think this is the kind of a really truly blinding insight, and I don't want to lose its precision. So this is Bachelard's Narcissus. And it's about, what I think he's talking about in the Reverie book, is this dialectical play, if you like, between surface and depth. Or the notion of it's the enchanting notion of a measure. So Sarah Austin's measure, the normativity, the measure of the self, that comes out of the play between surface and depth. It takes Bachelard to a meditation on the reflection of the face in a mirror. And that's where he goes to the Mallarmé poem. But he says, look, the difference between Mallarmé's poem and Ovid's Narcissus is the reflection is in a pool of flowing water. It's completely different. It's a play of images. He says that the reflection in the pool naturalises our self-image. He refers to a philosopher called Lavelle, who I wanted to refer to, but again, I didn't really have time, and I thought it might overburden an already burdened structure. So the idea is that the silvered round of the mirror is a kind of barrier, a resistance to Narcissus. Bachelard flips it. He says the reflection in the fountain pool is this kind of open path of the imagination and to a participation with something that lies at the source of the reflecting pool that Narcissus is looking into. And he calls this a primordial inscription in the world, a writing into the world. He says this, when one, I'm glossing it, when one dreams profoundly, and he means here a reverie as opposed to a dream, in his idea of the Freudian, or the psychoanalytical or Freudian idea of dream, is that in the dream we're erased. It's as if somebody or something else is dreaming us, the unconscious is dreaming us. Whereas in reverie, we're not entirely erased, we're always somehow there, we're always somehow present within the reverie. And I think it links to his argument that we return, that it's linked to the poetic image. That really his concern is with poetic reverie. In other words, you have to be half awake and half asleep to record what happened in a poetic image, a striking poetic image, which in turn communicates you the poet's fascination, the poet's attachment, the poet's participation with the world, which one can't do when one is asleep, properly asleep, disappeared into the night, erased in the night, as if one is being dreamt by another person. I think he gets that wrong. I think there's a way, as I say, of perhaps coordinating a kind of reading of psychoanalysis with what Bachelard is doing. But the key point here is that if one is in this profound reverie, he says this, and it's normative language, one must dream of a pool. One must dream of a pool, not a mirror. And then he kind of glosses it. Or one must dream of the material of the world. So it's about your inscription in the material of the world. The pool in your reflection in the pool is you doubled. You more than yourself. Not less than yourself, more than yourself. A superfluity of yourself. Another imago of the self to be introjected, if you like. So Narcissus is a reverie about superfluity. About a mode of attention that's different from the everyday. Point is that Narcissus is not looking upon the image in the mirror in a room that presents a clear image in a stable light, staring upon reflection in the play of water. It's altogether different geometry. There's reflection in a fountain pool. There's none of the resistance of steel and glass that provides a clear framing of the viewer. He's reverie on the image in the water. The reflection in that fountain, and this is where Bachelard uses this great word, participation, is a participation with the material of nature, even with the very source of the river itself. So it's a strangely compelling image. So it's a revelation of, quote, at least in English, identity and duality. And he relates it to a doubling power, which he says it's a doubling female power. And he's kind of doing a little bit of Jung here, a little bit of animus and anima, which I think is, I'm not entirely persuaded by that, but it kind of works within his argument. I think, as I said, I think there's probably a more interesting argument that would go via Narcissus and a different kind of line in psychoanalysis. This is then this idea, this swelling into a more than being, then. A reverie assembles being around its dreamer. It gives an illusion of being more than he is. But the illusion is real, so it's a paradoxical expression. You both are and are not more than you are. It's an imago. It's as real as an image is. Thus, upon this less than being, which is the relaxed state where the reverie takes off from, there emerges an outlining relief, a relief which the poet will know how to swell into a more than being. The poet knows how to do this, or to the extent that we are poetics, we are involved in a poetics of the self, to the extent that we are Bowie, to the extent that we are trying to be creative, to the extent that we are trying to invent, we become more than ourselves. And that involves a degree of self-love, I guess, a degree of a Narcissus of life rather than a Narcissus of death. This, and I'll stop in about 5 minutes, if that's all right, about 2 minutes. This takes us to HD. Who's not talking about Narcissus. I think she's talking about Persephone. But in this poem it's called Psyche, she's talking about the soul. And it's a long poem. Well, it's 4 stanzas, so I've just pulled this one out. If I could name this god, Persephone in hell would lift her quivering lids and smile. The mysteries hid, escaping all the years, alike both priest and cynic, would smilingly prevail. Dead men, that should be. Interesting slip, men, mean, measure. I've probably made that mistake. Dead men would start and move toward me to learn of love. I'm not sure who's speaking there. Is it Persephone that's speaking? Is it HD that's speaking? Is it Persephone that's speaking through HD, who's there between the lines, who's... HD is a kind of Sarah Austin who's summoned the spirits, and Psyche perhaps can only be summoned or spoken of indirectly. I think it's quite... The grammar's quite strange. It's this if, it's a long single sentence. I'm not sure whether there should be a full stop or not here. I think it's linked to Bachelard at the level of images, at the level of a descent and a resurfacing. It becomes much clearer in the later stanzas, which I didn't think I'd have time to talk about, which are almost readable through the law of the imagination, in that it involves a descent, it involves the underworld, it involves these hard images of crystals and metal, which are subjects of Bachelard's other books, and which are overwritten, I think overdetermined, by this figure of descending and ascending, with this ambiguous message, an ambiguous message of love or fascination, which is, I think, in some ways a bridge in this paper between an idea of fascination with the world and a kind of intersubjective fascination, or indeed a love for other people. You can love the world, you can love other people. With, of course, this is not a kind of... Clearly, there is a lot of work to do on the dialectic of love and hate and all that stuff, so that's there as well. Clearly, you can't do all that with a poem. I just need that to be in touch, I think, with what HD is trying to say here. And I think what might be more sensible is just to try and move towards an attempt to pull all these ideas together in a brief conclusion. So that's HD reclining. Obviously, HD was analysed by Freud, although Freud said that HD analysed him. And I don't think that's... No, I'm not sure where she is there, but I don't think she's with Freud. This is then just an attempt to produce a concluding reverie on jurisprudence, to look at this language that Bachelard is using, and to say, well, it's simultaneously poetic and normative. This is a different jurisprudence that is a poetic jurisprudence. It's therefore it's about being bound, but it's about being bound in the way that a poet is bound, a translator is bound, somebody in love is bound, or somebody who is in love with the world, or fascinated or provoked by something is bound. So this law, the la loi, can be imagined, and obviously it's primordial law. It's not. It has got everything and nothing to do with le droit, with the legal system. They contaminate. They're bound up together. This is ultimately perhaps a way that one could think about law. It's not necessarily an anarchism. It doesn't mean, I'm not trying to say by perhaps wildest moods, replace the law with poetry. I think in my wildest dreams I would think that, but then in the daylight world I wouldn't. But I'm allowing that dream. This doesn't necessarily mean that. It's something going on within jurisprudence. It's about reading John Austen and Sarah Austin at the same time. That would be my more sober academic defence of it. My political dreamers, anarchism would be a different argument altogether, but that's for the night time. So this law, la loi, can be imagined as a conscious becoming stuck or compelled by an image or poetic language or a song. To complete this line of analysis for the moment, note that the soul of the dreamer, or indeed the reader or the translator, is the thing bound. The soul's not purity, the soul is androgynous, the soul is entirely double, the soul is a cycling of imagos and images, and it's a way in which we deal with our own ambiguity. So I don't think our depths reveal any essence to us. They reveal a play of surfaces, they reveal the play of imagos. This being bound, the bond of poetic obligation, clearly this is only the beginning of an attempt to work out what this might mean. It's not a demand. In a certain sense, it's not a demand. I mean, again, demand and normative, this is, you do jurisprudence, you filter your way through all these kind of normative terms, a demand. And can show itself, well, it can be an amusement. The reverie, in part, is an amusement with the world. It's not heavy. It's this kind of, I guess it's a play between lightness and heaviness, gravity and something else, the Apollonian and Dionysian, perhaps. Perhaps even a desire to keep on reading, to keep on writing, or to keep on talking, or to keep on listening. Perhaps all of these things. As a preliminary to the law, then, one needs to keep in mind that it's a title of, very disappointing title, The Right to Dream, a title of a collection of Bachelard's essays, which is actually, if you seize upon it and read it in the hope that he's going to reveal all this stuff, it's not mentioned within it. But nevertheless, he's using a normative language, he's using a jurisprudential language, the right to dream. And if there was a crisp encapsulation of what we're talking about here, I think it's just that. The right to dream does not relate to any positive source. It's not a human, well, perhaps it could be translated into a human right. Its source is not human right, its source is the soul's fascination with the world. If it has documents, and lawyers are obviously obsessed with documents and sources, these documents are the texts of poets. And in the reader responding to the poem, if you like, the right in question then is located in the imagination of the poet, the poetic text, and in the response to that text. And thus a participation in what we might call a poetic sense of the world. So right in this sense is the opening of the imagination to its active being in the world. A right given by the world that thinks itself in poetic images, or that is what I mean by being bound in wonder. Thank you very much. I'll stop there.
Many thanks, Adam. It's been an extremely rich paper. I'm sure there are lots of questions or comments. I mean, perhaps I can kick off and then open it up to the floor. I mean, one thing that struck me when you were talking about the contemplation of the pool and the water as opposed to the mirror, and that the idea that nature somehow that triggers reverie, which then somehow opens the dreamer, if you want to call them, or the rêveur. It gives them an opening to the cosmos and the poetic imagination. It sort of reminded me a bit of Jean-Jacques Rousseau. I don't know, Anne will correct me if I get the reference wrong. Yeah, sorry. But and I think is it in Reverie number 5 or something. He's on an island in Lac de Bienne or something in Switzerland, and there's a moment where Rousseau is talking about a reverie that's triggered by the movement of the waves on the lake, and it's all about when you use the expression relaxed fascination or something, and he loses himself in the moment and he's kind of locked in the present, so he's removed from all notion of time, past and present. So I suppose to formulate that as a question, I mean, does Bachelard talk about also at any point, or particularly given that text by Rousseau specifically uses the word reverie?
Yes. That's a brilliant question. I've read it recently, and I can't remember a direct reference to Rousseau. I may simply be wrong on that point. But I think if it's an idea of time in there, the idea of childhood as something revisited in Reverie. So the idea of, if you like, a non-linear time, so Reverie is this always a doubling, and so in the reveries of childhood, because there's I guess the link with Rousseau at one level would be there is the innocence of the child, which is somehow wordsworthy, and again that's slightly that's not the same thing, Joe. I'm sure you will. But the point really being here is that for Bachelard and for the time of Reverie, and half the book is, I think it's translated as Reveries towards childhood. I think, which sounds quite strange, but I think the idea is that the temporality of Reverie is at least as far as childhood is concerned, it's a non-linearity, because you revisit, you go back in time, but you revisit it differently. You re-articulate it through that revisiting. So it's either a kind of, I kind of tried to get it through Heidegger, through a kind of ecstasies of temporality, where there's clock time, which is an onward progression, and then there's different kinds of time which are sensuous, which are imaginative, or indeed the time of the unconscious, or the psyche. And so the reveries of childhood, this revisiting of what was and its reconstruction actually in Reverie, comes very, very close to the ideas of transference, I think, which is, again, a different kind of psychoanalytic notion of time and of reconstruction of and a revisiting of things, but through the transference with the analysis, where you bring the unsaid into the said. You bring the essentially the inaccessible nature of your past, although clearly it's symptoms or whatever it is that's revisiting itself upon you. You give it a language, you come to know it through through a complex phenomena, but which, at least in terms of your point, involves a non-temporal temporality. It involves a non-clock time. It involves an imaginative time or an unconscious time or a time of poetic in the root meaning of the term, in the sense that you remake yourself through active memory. And hopefully in that remaking you move beyond trauma or what have you. Sorry.
I'm sorry. I'll spoil the second question and I'll hand over to someone else. But on that note, there was the motif also of, you talk about descent and ascent. And I did wonder, given that, as you pointed out, Bachelard is obsessed by the poetic image and Reverie as an opening to the poetic image. I did wonder whether he wasn't thinking of Orpheus as well. Particularly as the god of poetry and this idea of descent into the underworld and reascent, sort of replenished. It's a sort of motif of renewal, isn't it?
Exactly.
And because Mallarmé talks a lot about that as well. I mean, so in many of his poems about, he references Orpheus directly or indirectly. So I wondered whether that.
It's a beautiful point, because it did I'm not, again, I may be wrong on this, but I'm not sure Orpheus is present within either the Reverie book or Water and Dreams. Whether or not he's there in the various kind of the Earth books or the Air, is it called Air and Dreams? I can't remember now. Poe seems to be a figure that is way more present, and Poe's mythologizing is, I think, more present than perhaps Orpheus, although I did nearly make the terrible mistake of using the image of Cocteau. Who's the actor in Cocteau, the actor who plays Orpheus, from the front of the Smiths record as well, so it kind of, there he is kind of lying, so it looks like it might be Narcissus because he's lying by a puddle, but it's Orpheus. I think there was undoubtedly that figure of the descent and the ascent and the ambiguous return from the underworld. I think that's there, but I'm not absolutely sure that at least in the kind of the dreaming books, the kind of the Water and the Airy books, the Orpheus appears there, which does seem odd. And it's problematic for the psychic jurisprudence argument, because I've got to go elsewhere to try and use that material. But no, it's Rilke, of course, who's important for Valerie. So it's kind of there. Valerie is a presence in the Reverie book, but not the poetry about Orpheus, which is strange. Yes.
Sorry, other questions?
Somebody said, I don't know if it was your words or you were translating the Reverie as a detached fascination.
Yeah.
Is that you?
That's a very, very loose translation of a kind of a load of statements from Bachelard,
So, and does that produce transcendence?
The transcendence that it produces, I think, is a going further in. I'm not sure I'm not sure again that the term appears that often in Bachelard.
Or which word?
Transcendence. I think if anything, there's always a return to the material. I don't get the sense of, it's a very crude way of getting at your question, Tony, but I'm not sure he's a Christian thinker. I'm not sure that there's a there's a transcendence of the material to some kind of godhead or something like
I'm
that.
not thinking of Christianity.
So I'm having real trouble hearing you, Paul, because of...
I'm not thinking of Christianity. I just,
No, sure.
when I was talking about detached, the word detached
Oh,
from
right.
the world, that in a lot of traditions, transcendence you get to by starting out being detached, but you end up connected to everything.
Okay,
So
yeah.
it's kind of an interesting, help me with the word for that, folks. You know.
Almost like a pantheism or a Buddhism or some...
Immanence?
No, just opposite concepts.
Yeah.
But actually not opposite. Whatever that word is.
Dichotomy.
Thank you.
What did you say, Joe? Sorry.
It's a dichotomy.
Oh, sorry, right.
It's a dichotomy.
I mean, I think I'd probably a dichotomy that's kind of mobilised dialectically, I guess. Schopenhauer appears in, I think, the Reverie book or possibly the Water and Dreams, but I think like a lot of the time with Bachelard, kind of people come into focus and they go out of focus quite quickly. And so that kind of the sudden appearance of Schopenhauer, I thought, oh, is this going to become somehow kind of appropriation of, I don't know, Buddhist ideas or Eastern ideas? And it kind of almost appears, and then he kind of moves away again, which I think either makes him quite a frustrating writer, or indeed a writer that's just kind of constantly mobilising fragments. Then the fragments kind of take his imagination and he goes with them, and then he leaves them behind and he kind of goes on to something else, which I think is the invitation to the strong reader, if you like, to try and work with those fragments. And I think what I would understand your reading to be is a strong reading of Bachelard, to say, well, which, you could do in any number of ways, I'm sure. And again, if anybody knows, that the extent to which, say, when Bachelard is writing this stuff, it's what, the 40s, 50s, 60s possibly. Just what is, I don't know, in terms of the milieu that he's moving in, I mean, is there a kind of a neo-Schopenhauerian thing going on? Or it would beg those kind of questions, wouldn't it, as to just what he is emerging from, what he's taking from.
And he's around, he knows Jung, right? He knows Carl Jung.
He's much more sympathetic to Jung than he is to Freud. And again, the bits that seem to come into focus are the ideas of animus and anima. And Ludwig, I was about to say his name, and Heideggerian psychoanalyst, Ludwig Binswanger. Binswanger appears and disappears in footnotes.
The reason I ask is because everyone's talking about this ascent-descent thing.
Yeah.
But Jung, I think in his Memories, Dreams, and Reflections, there's a whole passage on dreaming down and going down to the basement.
Yes, exactly.
What you find there, so it could also be...
Without a doubt. I mean, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, there's a lot about alchemy in there, which is coming from Jung. And again, I'm not absolutely sure what to do with that. I find it quite compelling, and that kind of mysterious working out the female principle and the male principle and the mixing of it. It all seems extremely... It's part of the fragments that he's mobilising in that book. But again, it almost, for me, it became, well, what bits can I directly use and what bits must I just allow almost to go off in their own orbits? And the idea of perhaps trying to work my way through Jung, although I find Jung quite compelling, it would become yet an argument too far, if you like. But again, those fragments are certainly there. And the figure of the descent and the ascent, I think, is thought through Jung, I think. So I think you're undoubtedly right, yes.
I'm curious as to why you've gone to the law. Why jurisprudence? I mean, I always think of Bachelard as an epistemologist rather than any sort of legal scholar.
Nice point.
I'm far from an expert in Bachelard, but he wrote a book on the formation of the development of science.
No, absolutely. That's a really good question. Can I answer it in a fairly oblique way? There's a kind of genius. So the person the starting point for the thinking that I'm engaged with is more than me. It was a kind of for want of a better word, a reception of postmodernity or post-structuralism within legal thinking. And Derrida was incredibly important. So I first came across Bachelard through Derrida and through Althusser. Althusser, weirdly enough, as well, where that clearly Bachelard as a historian of science and the idea of the rupture and what have you is incredibly important. But that Bachelard became, I think for me, increasingly overdetermined by the later Bachelard, by the poetics. But that entire, again as a digression, that entire trajectory is of such interest. I'm not a historian of science. I lack, one day given time, I would like to work backwards from the poetics to the history of science, but that's beyond me at the moment. The idea of why jurisprudence, well, it's a curse, really. I mean, if you end up in jurisprudence, and which always had this reputation of being a bit like, who was it, talking about practical literary criticism as being like, being the academic equivalent of being like night soil. You know, it's like this kind of, what is this thing that you're doing? You're not a poet, you're not a writer, you're merely writing about other people's writing. And jurisprudence had this thing, everybody hated it, it was incredibly turgid. It was, you know, most practicing lawyers would go, well, I've got to do this, what's this got to do? You know, it was this kind of turn-off subject. And rightly so, it's an incredibly, incredibly turgid body of work. And so it was a kind of challenge, really, to try and kick some life into it. And I think there was, as a kind of a generation of people who were either frustrated poets, failed singers, failed actors, you know, who ended up in law as a desperate attempt to reinvent themselves and get jobs. They never left behind the bit of themselves that wanted to be David Bowie or whatever. And so, well, a friend of mine's just written a book on the law and David Bowie. So it is part of, and that's the trouble, because, you know, we're in the little law school over there and we do our thing. We rarely ever get out and see, you know, play with the cool kids. We just, you know, you think, oh, well, it's not so strange. That's just what happened. I ended up in jurisprudence. No, it was an accident, really. I would never have anticipated that, but it became a kind of a foil, really, which then became a kind of blessing, because unlike somebody like Joe who does, oh, you know, everybody here does proper work with literature, that you can kind of get away with things. And I think there was a lot of people who jumped on that bandwagon and got away with a lot because lawyers didn't know that much about literature or philosophy, but that was perhaps 20, 30 years ago. And everybody caught up pretty quickly. And so it became harder to make the moves that impressed people 20 years ago. And which, again, is a stir to action, isn't it? A call to action. But so, yeah, I mean, that's the thing. It might...
Does this help us understand jurisprudence better?
It would help. Well, that's a good question. I'd hope no, in some ways. I'd hope it would completely turn off a lot of people that think that jurisprudence is just about a legal system. I think there's a way of bringing the two things together, but I think the closer jurisprudence, or indeed ethical thinking, comes to poetics, I think that's a win for all concerned. And I think that what lurks behind jurisprudence is a lot of incredibly turgid arguments about ethics, which are kind of done in the frame of, you know, you can't derive an ought from an is, whereas I just think there is just an ought. The fascination is the ought. Our being is being compelled. We are, by our very nature as human beings, I know this is incredibly trite, but is an ought. And so what jurisprudence always tried to do was dodge ethics and say, oh, all that really law is about is what the sovereign says it is. So it dodges a lot of really difficult problematical poetic, ethical, political issues. As soon as you bring all that back in, it becomes an interesting subject. So people like Tony, who's been a trailblazer, really, in terms of this kind of work, because it largely coming out of, like, you know, America and out of the US, out of UK. There are some, so critical legal studies was one of the things, primarily the US thing.
Stanley Fish and
No, exactly. But Stanley Fish denounced me publicly, so yeah, Cardozo. But I don't care because he's wrong. He wasn't playing. No, it was a. I won't go on about it.
Do you want this on the record?
Oh yeah, no, I better not go on about it. I'll that's perhaps for another time. But no, it was a thrill being denounced by Stanley Fish.
Adam, you remember I was denounced at Cardozo.
You've been denounced at Cardozo.
That's another
Yes.
story. But we'll go.
You were denounced by Avitel Ronell, weren't you?
was.
Yeah. That's another thing that we. Yeah. No, we both. These were different times. We've both been denounced.
But you were there. You saw it happen.
I saw that happen. Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry. Did you want to come back? Are you quite sure? Yeah. Okay. Thanks so much, Adam. Yeah. I feel like I've been in a Moon Age daydream, full of sound and vision.
Yeah, very good.
And with a lot of strange fascination, and I've ended up unwashed and somewhat slightly
Yeah,
dazed.
excellent work.
And as always with you, there's so many things, different directions one can go. So, for instance, Mallarmé, I would have loved to hear, or maybe with you and Damien, I could still hear more about Mallarmé, but I want to make a simple observation and a simple but broad question. Simple observation is you talked about rivers and the self, I think.
Okay.
And maybe the multiple self or the reflection of the self. And I just happened that only yesterday, I was rereading Langston Hughes' poem, The Negro Speaks of Rivers. So maybe other people would like to talk about it as well. But I was thinking that yesterday, the poem about how he uses the river as a way of talking about a multiplicity of selves, almost conjured within one poetic voice, and a trances. Put it that way.
Yeah.
And also conjuring a sense of an ancient tradition of, in this particular case, what he calls the Negro or black people as being sort of maybe more ancient, more fundamental than white civilization, maybe white law as well. Okay, so there's a sort of observation you might like to say something about that, about the river and the self in that context. And then I had a rather different question, which is it's broad but it's simple, which is, there was lots of Bachelard in French on the screen, and you've read lots of Bachelard in French to do this. So I'd like to hear, what do you make of Bachelard as a French writer? He's writing a lot about Reverie, and so do you feel that his writing in French has any quality of Reverie to it?
That's a real... Can I kind of almost come into that in reverse and bring Tony in? Because I'm not a big reader of Langston Hughes, but I'll tell you, I'll come back and then perhaps go to Tony and then try and tie the ends together if you're happy with that.
I have no idea what you're going to say.
Oh, okay. Let's just see what happens.
Yes.
Yeah, okay. I think the thing that any movement between, so this perhaps goes back to the translation thing, and I'm not a translator, I've never, it was of necessity. I had to read it in French because I couldn't get it in English, and I read French incredibly slowly, and I cheat as far as I can. But then you are confronted with the obvious thing that one language never, I'm going to say a lot of trite things, one language doesn't map onto another language, and so you're forced back on your own reserves, as it were. And the way a French sentence works clearly is very different from the way an English sentence works. My French is not good enough to get any the nuances or to really get at it, but just I think in a very, very basic way to be confronted with that difficulty of transparency. You read in a language that you're fluent in, it's as if it's transparent to you, although for me transparency always leads to other things. But that is that passage in a sense from those connections that you're making because you are already fluent in that language or in that culture. And so it slows me down, it compels me to read in a different way, I think to think in a different way. And the thing that springs to mind is something that Iris Murdoch says, which I'm sure I've told you before, because I think it's a really great thing, where she compares the difficulty of actually not reading in a foreign language, but talking a foreign language, and the humility that it forces you into, and the difficulty that it forces you into. She compares it to praying. I'm not a religious person at all. And I thought it was an interesting link that kind of confrontation with what you took to be fluid, transparent, that brought you kind of directly to other people, is a source of embarrassment, is a source of evasion, is a source of difficulty, which less so when you're reading, you're obviously reading in your own time. Once you're in the temporality of spoken language, it's entirely different. And a useful experience, and one that's not an answer to your question, but I think the more time that I would love a greater facility and fluency to get at what I can think I can get in English in a different language, but that's going to take who knows how much time we've got. And I curse myself because I didn't start earlier. I was never, So yes, to be able to perceive style. Perhaps it's like the ability to tell a joke or to appreciate a joke in another language that, again, would take you to a level of fluency that is hard-won and a major human achievement. And And in the last of that kind of inarticulate answer, it almost strikes me that's the point of why artificial intelligence is garbage, and what the mark of the human is, well, what's the point of doing that? Artificial intelligence makes everything simpler and faster, but the point of this is the opposite. It's to be involved in a complex project for the sake of being involved in a complex project, for the superfluity that it would hopefully bring. So the perversity of the human being is to want difficulty, I think, to not want things to be made easy. And a massively evasive question. I'm wondering, again, perhaps to go to Langston Hughes, who I'm not a big reader of, but that water, I mean, so much to be said, I think. I would love to, again, have the time to read back into these. I mean, Lucille Clifton, I think, who I, again, came upon by accident, but is a phenomenal poet. Not much more light imagery, I think, in Lucille. She plays on her name, Lucille Lux and Light, which, again, is helpful in a kind of Bachelardian way, but and again in a psychic jurisprudence, in the spirits, she communicates with spirits, so psyche is involved, but again that's not a good enough answer to your question, I'm afraid. Great question.
I think unfortunately that probably brings us to the end of it. Many thanks.
Thank you very much
really
indeed. Thank you.
Stimulating.